Hello and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University, and I'm also Director of the Future of the Humanities Project and Senior Advisor to the President of Georgetown University, Washington, DC. Today is the fifth event in the Christian Literary Imagination series, which is sponsored by Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today I'll be welcoming Professor John Drakakis, who will be talking about the dramatist Cyril Tourneur's play of 1611, or at least printed in 1611, called The Atheist's Tragedy. After his talk, I will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience, and we have a good number registered for today's discussion. We encourage you to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using your Q&A key at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them, and we will endeavour to answer them today, or if not today, later by email. And what another interesting talk we have for you today on a not widely known, but an insightful Jacobean drama, The Atheist's Tragedy. Although it is not often performed, I show my age by saying that I remember seeing a lively production of the play at the Belgrade Theatre, Coventry in 1979. Before John begins, because this is such a play that's not known, let me give you a short synopsis of the play. Danville, the atheist, wishes to marry his son Roussard to Castabella, daughter of Baron Belforest. But she loves Charlemont, the son of Baron Montferrez, the brother of Danville. Charlemont goes away through Danville's connivance on military service, where reportedly he dies. Castabella marries Roussard, unknowingly as part of a plan by her father Belforest and Danville to gain his brother's Montferrez fortune. Danville then murders his brother Montferrez. A ghost appears to his son Charlemont, urging him not to revenge, but saying that revenge is in the hands of God. Danville tries to have Charlemont murdered, but his two sons, Roussard and Sebastian, unexpectedly die. Charlemont is accused of murdering the servant accomplice of Danville's, named Borachio. Danville is to be the innocent Charlemont's executioner, but raising his axe to strike, he accidentally strikes himself. Confessing his misdeeds and acknowledging a greater power, he dies. This leaves Charlemont to marry Castabel with the moral that patience is the honest man's revenge. As you may have realized from this convoluted plot, it is a story built on what one critic calls two diametrically opposed conceptions of man's position in the universe, and between the ethical systems entailed by these conceptions. Let me leave it at that and introduce John to you. Professor John Drakakis is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Stirling, Scotland. He was one of a group of Shakespearean critics who in the 1980s and 1990s changed the face of Shakespearean criticism and the means and methodologies of our approach towards Shakespeare's work. His 1985 edition of the Alternative Shakespeares is an essential book for all students of Shakespeare. John is general editor of Routledge New Critical Idiom series and is a contributing editor to the revision of Geoffrey Buller's marathon, The Narrative and Dramatic Sources of Shakespeare. He's also the editor of Arden 3, The Merchant of Venice. I'm delighted that he's back with us today and has agreed to talk to us about The Atheist's Tragedy. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Michael. As you will have gathered from that rather convoluted plot, this is not an easy play to summarize. So I'm going to focus on certain issues which I think will help you to understand. And I begin with a reference to E.M.W. Tilliard, whose Elizabethan World Picture appeared in 1944. And Tilliard glosses Ulysses' speech, Ulysses in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, by invoking the opening of the homily on obedience. The homilies were read regularly in church to congregations. The homily he chooses is an exhortation concerning good order and obedience in rulers and magistrates. And for a long time, Tilliard was, the source of wisdom on what Shakespeare's audiences believed. However, commenting on the homily's emphasis on God's creation of all things in heaven and earth and waters in a most excellent and perfect order, Jonathan Dollimore has argued that homilies like this, he says, like this one, did not correspond to what people could not help but believe. They were in part a dominant reaction to emergent social forces. And Dollimore goes on to suggest that atheism was part of a developing skepticism about concepts such as providence and nature, or indeed of the soul's immortality and of the existence of heaven or hell. At the beginning of the 5th book of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, in 1597, Richard Hooker thought that a discussion of the topic of atheism should act as a preface to everything that follows. And his definition of atheism, I think, is one that's worth quoting in full. He says, "The fountain and wellspring of which impiety is a resolved purpose of mind to reap in this world what sensual profit or pleasure soever the world yieldeth, and not to be barred from any whatsoever means available thereunto. And that this is the very radical cause of their atheism, no man, I think, will doubt, which considereth what pains they take to destroy those principal spurs and motives unto all virtue. The creation of the world, the providence of God, the resurrection of the dead, the joys of the kingdom of heaven, and the endless pains of the wicked, yea, above all things, the authority of Scripture, because on these points it evermore beateth, and the soul's immortality, which granted, draweth easily after it the rest as a voluntary train." Now, Hooker was perfectly well aware of the ways in which religion could be used as an ideological weapon, and at a time when his faith was repeatedly challenged on the public stage by figures such as Marlowe's Machiavel. And in the induction to the Jew of Malta, this is what Machiavel has to say. He says, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance. Birds of the air will tell of murders past. I'm ashamed to hear such fooleries. What right had Caesar to the empery? Might first made kings, and laws were then most sure, when like the Dracos they were writ in blood." Now, Marlowe himself was, as we know, posthumously accused of atheism, and a strain of unbelief runs through the entire corpus of Jacobean tragedy. Now, I want to argue that Cyril Turner's The Atheist's Tragedy taps directly into these religious controversies, although it does so with elements of irony and humour that force us to ask how seriously we should take it. What we might call the play's moral vision seems to me to be so exaggerated and schematized that it threatens to subvert the morality on which it's based, and so delights in its extremes to make the plight of the protagonist, Danville, something with which we might be invited to empathize. Now, indeed, the ingenious plotting and the sensational violence exert a temporary fascination for us as we see the protagonist spinning plot lines and constantly failing to achieve his goals. Now, we know very little about Cyril Turner, other than the fact that he served in the household of a nobleman, one Sir Francis de Vere, although more recently his authorship of another play, Revenge's Tragedy, usually attributed to him, has been brought into question. Turner's credited with a poetic satire called The Transformed Metamorphosis, which appeared in 1600, a prose tract, Laugh and Lie Down, or The World's Folly, 1605, and a funeral poem upon the death of the most worthy and true soldier, Sir Francis Vere, 1609. Now, there's been some doubt about the dating of the Atheist's Tragedy, with the suggestion that it was written and performed some years before it was printed in 1611. Possible dates range from 1602 to 1607, and the play is sometimes linked with George Chapman's Bussy Damboy's plays and Shakespeare's King Lear. Now, Turner's play opens with a dialogue between Danville and his instrument, Borachio, about the operations of nature, and in particular, the similarity between man and beast. He says, Borachio, thou art read in nature and her large philosophy. Observest thou not the very self-same course of revolution, both in man and beast? Now, given the genealogy of Borachio's name, right, Borachio, drunkard, how seriously are we to take this discussion? Borachio's chopped logic equates man and beast in a way that all but diminishes his stature. The same, he says, for birth, growth, state, decay, and death, only a man's beholding to his nature for the better composition of the two. The question is, where does man's nature come from? Not only that, if man's not free to exercise the advantages of his nature, then he's a fool, as little knowing as a beast. Borachio then jumps quickly to the conclusion that shows there's nothing in man above his nature. If there were, considering 'tis his being's excellency, it would not yield to nature's weakness. Now this, of course, cuts through the Christian doctrine of the immortality of the soul, since death is here pinpointed as a weakness in nature. Danville gets the point immediately, and he proposes an Epicurean conclusion that inverts those strictures that Hooker outlined in his comments on atheism. He says, then if death casts up our total sum of joy and happiness, let me have all my senses feasted in the abundant fullness of delight at once, and with a sweet, insensible increase of pleasing surfeit, melt into my dust. Borachio's canny response is to challenge Danville's carpe diem philosophy as improvident. He says, how improvident it were to spend our substance on a minute's pleasure and after live an age in misery. Again, Danville seizes on the conclusion that, quote, pleasure only flows upon the stream of riches. And he recasts the meaning of honesty to bring the concept into line with the acquisition of wealth. The wealthy man, it seems, can dispense charity, but the poor man who cannot is by definition dishonest. Once having revised the meaning of honesty, Danville turns his attention to himself and to his own providence. It's another one of these words that's very important in this play. Had not my body spread itself into posterity, perhaps I should desire no more increase of substance than would hold proportion with mine own dimensions. Yet even in that sufficiency of state, a man has reason to provide and add, for what is he has such a present eye, and so prepared a strength that can foresee and fortify his substance and himself against those accidents, the least whereof may rob him of an age's husbandry. As for my children, they are near to me as branches to the tree whereon they grow, and may as numerously be multiplied. As they increase, so should my providence, for from my substance they receive the sap whereby they live and flourish. Now, this long quotation is worth pondering over for a moment. I mean, here Danville lays out his insurance against accidents that may rob him of his husbandry. In short, He is the source of providence in that he's provided for his posterity. Now, this is a very different kind of providence from the one that Hamlet comes to recognize when he returns to Denmark. Remember, he says there is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And it's also very different from the kind of providence that Calvin outlines in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he notes that the Christian heart, since it has been thoroughly persuaded that all things happen by God's plan and that nothing takes place by chance, will ever look to him as the principal cause of things, yet will give attention to the secondary causes in their proper place. Then the heart will not doubt that God's singular providence keeps watch to preserve it, and will not suffer anything to happen but what may turn out to its good and salvation. For Damville, the claim is that providence is produced by man, who manages his substance, and the more substance he can accumulate, the more he can provide. Now, all of this is rendered retrospectively ironical when Charlemont enters, forcing Damville to contradict himself. Charlemont wants to go to the wars, but his father's forbidden it. Damville takes the opportunity not only to extol honor, but to finance Charlemont's venture at the expense of catering, it would seem, for his own posterity. He says, I'll disinherit my posterity to purchase honor. 'Tis an interest I prize above the principle of wealth. He provides Charlemont with 1,000 crowns, but after the latter leaves, Borachio returns to the substance of our former argument, which of course was wealth. Damville's hypocrisy is, however, instrumental insofar as the happy absence of this Charlemont is a subject for commodious providence. Here's an example of Damville's materialistic providence in action, in that his gesture to Charlemont will give him access to Montferrat's, his older brother's, wealth. The scene ends with the entry of Damville's two sons, Roussard and Sebastian, both of whom embody another strand in the protagonist's providential strategy. He says, here are my sons, there's my eternity. My life in them and their succession shall forever live, and in my reason dwells the providence to add to life as much of happiness. Let all men lose, so I increase my gain. I have no feeling of another's pain. Now, this expression of a Marlovian individualism is an attempt to cheat death, and it stands in contrast to Charlemont's wish to augment the reputation of his family by adding something substantial to the honor of his predecessors. Montferrat finally gives in, but his "Pray God my forced grant proved not ominous" acknowledges a force above human control that Damville immediately challenges. Ominous, he says? In what? It cannot be in anything but death, and I am of a confident belief that even the time, place, manner of our deaths do not follow fate with that necessity that makes us sure to die. And in a thing ordained so certainly, unalterable, what can the use of providence prevail? Here, the committed atheist acknowledges the irrefutable terminal nature of death, over which a Christian providence can have no control, and for which for the atheist, there may be no certainty. In his philosophical account of atheism, the philosopher Alexandra Kojève notes that, quote, for the atheist, there is nothing outside the world, and this nothing is given to her. The translator uses the feminine pronoun throughout for what I suspect are political reasons, but it's given to her in the givenness to her of her absolute finitude. So from the very beginning of the play, Turner offers us two opposing definitions of providence. The one orthodox and a quality reserved for Godhead, and the other materialistic that entertains no supernatural future beyond the inevitable fact of death. The play concerns itself with the tension between Christian providence and the material providence of the atheists, whose rationality cannot extend beyond a conception of the physical world. Indeed, we might think of much of the play's plotting as Danville's abortive attempt to make provision for himself and his chaotic family. Now, in one sense, Belforest, Charlemont, and Castabella are victims of what Calvin identified as secondary causes. Danville's plot to get rid of Charlemont produces a reaction in Castabella that takes the form of fear that she describes to the outrageous Langbo Snuff. Did you ever hear, she says, that when a certain great man went to the war, the lovely face of heaven was masked with sorrow? The sighing winds did move the breast of earth. The heavy clouds hung down their mourning heads, and wept sad showers the day that he went hence, as if the day presaged some ill success that fatally should kill his happiness. And so it came to pass. Snuff dismisses this as superstition. And we'll later discover that the ill success that Castabella fears is not the consequence of some divine reaction, but is engineered by Danville's plotting. The venal Langbo Snuff is entrusted with Castabella and is promised to qualify her grief with the spirit of consolation, along with Charlemont's equally venal, though unwitting response, is open to conflicting interpretations. Castabella's response to Charlemont's departure is couched in terms of a reaction in nature, and this takes us to the second term that the play problematizes. Danville plans to marry Castabella to his son Roussard, but she's resistant and Roussard is sickly, and it turns out later unable to consummate the marriage. Castabella's resistance, that she herself acknowledges, is unnatural, and her mother Levidulcia is quick to invoke nature, but in terms that echo Danville's materialistic interpretation of providence. She says, nature, the loving mother of us all, brought forth a woman for her own relief, by generation to revive her age, which now thou hast ability and means presented most unkindly dost deny. And she goes on, wise nature, therefore, hath reserved for an inducement to our sense our greatest pleasure in that greatest work, which being offered thee, thy ignorance refuses for the imaginary joy of an unsatisfied affection to an absent man. Levidulcia offers Castabella what the poet John Donne would call sublunary love, in an appeal that begins with reason but quickly switches to physical desire. Her image of the returning soldier whose blood once spent in the war and who is sick, lame, and impotent plays on the double meaning of blood as heritage and as physical desire, a combination that feeds into Danville's own sense of material prosperity. At the end of Act 2, it's Danville's second son, Sebastian, who calls Castabella's marriage for what it is, a rape, a rape, a rape, he says. And in a closing soliloquy, he launches into a scathing critique of the church. Now, the nature that Levidulcia invokes to justify the marriage of Castabella to Roussard is a force that exists separately from the nature shaped by some divine force. Indeed, her reliance on what motivates human behavior seems distinctly Lucretian, since in the nature of things, Lucretius begins by describing a world that acts independently from any kind of controlling deity. This is how Lucretius describes the operations of nature. He says, whatever shall exist of itself will either act upon something or will necessarily be passive in itself while other things act upon it. Or it will be possible that things be and be done in it. But nothing can act or be acted upon without body. Nothing can afford space but the void and the empty. Now, this seems to me to be the key to much of the plotting in the atheist tragedy, And this kind of atheism, and we should remember that Lucretius was not an atheist to court, but like Machiavelli, his description of the operation of human affairs was thought by Renaissance thinkers to be the case, is pitted against the play's counterbalancing force, which is the honest man's revenge, represented by Charlemagne. Of course, Damville can fake the rhetorical discourse of a conservative nature, but the context is one in which he is the manipulator of plots. The episode at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 2, in which Fresco and two servants get drunk, elicits this comment from Damville. He says, aside, "Fortune, I honour thee. My plot still rises according to the model of mine own desires." Damville's history is the history of the desiring subject, and throughout the play, he's the one who, until the last moment, acts upon others. But the murder of Montferrers, Charlemagne's father, is presented as an accident whose motivation is concealed. He says, "I mark the plot, not any circumstance that stood within the reach of the design of persons, dispositions, matter, time, or place, but by this brain of mine was made an instrumental help. Yet nothing from the induction to the accomplishment seemed forced or done a purpose, but by accident." Here, the philosophical rhetoric is designed to conceal a material driving force. And when thunder and lightning accompanied Damville and Baraccio's resume of the plot so far, and following Damville's rejection of him they call the supreme of the stars, making their influences governors of sublunary creatures when their selves are senseless of their operations, his explanation of the thunder and lightning is Lucretian in the extreme. He says, "To start at thunder, credit my belief, 'tis a mere effect of nature, an exhalation, hot and dry, involved within a watery vapour in the middle region of the air, whose coldness congealing that thick moisture to a cloud, the angry exhalation, shut within a prison of contrary quality, strives to be free, and with the violent eruption through the grossness of that cloud, makes this noise we hear." Now, Damville goes on to incorporate what he takes to be the favourable reactions of nature to his plots, because it did not warn the unfortunate Montferrers. Then propitious nature, he says, winked at our proceedings, now it doth express how that forbearance favoured our success. Now, some critics have noticed the similarity between Damville's approach to nature and that of Gloucester's bastard son Edmund in King Lear. Nature, you may remember, is Edmund's goddess, but this is a nature that is sui generis and not the product of divine predestination. This is what Edmund has to say in Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play. "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behaviour, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains of necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treasures by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of whoremaster man, to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star." Now, this is an accurate description of what we might call Damville's character. And it's an atheism that drives a wedge between divine thrusting on and the active evasions of whoremaster man. There's no doubting that Damville is an active agent in the play. He's the source of almost everything that takes place, and the sheer physicality of his investments in action are shared by the insatiable Levidulcia, Castabella's stepmother, as well as Baraccio and Langbeau Snuff. Against this formidable combination, the victim Charlemont has little chance, although despite his desire to secure honour through military action, he opts for patience. This was one of the virtues that Turner isolates in his funeral poem on the death of Sir Francis Vere. And aligned with the imperative to revenge, this is an unusual innovation on what had become by the early 17th century a developing tradition. Some of the ingredients of the revenge play are present here, as in the appearance of Montferrat's ghost to Charlemont, but the spectre urges him surprisingly to attend with patience the success of things, but leave revenge unto the King of Kings. The ghost counsels the opposite of the ghost of Hamlet, where revenge is urged against Claudius, but against Gertrude is forbidden. Turner makes of the victim, Charlemont, not a tragic hero, which we might initially be led to expect, but simply the recipient of a dream that he first questions, but very quickly, on the ghost's second appearance, comes to accept. What then can we make of an agent who is dissuaded from action? At the beginning of Act 3, it's Damville who hypocritically pronounces epitaphs on Montferrat and Charlemont, stating that the son's life was so true a practique of religion's theory that her divinity seemed rather the description than the instruction of his life. So what kind of divinity might Damville be referring to here? We get a sense of what might be at issue in the following encounter between the grieving Castabella, who's the victim of an enforced marriage to the weak and impotent Roussard, and a physically present Charlemont, whom she mistakenly, momentarily, thinks is a ghost. Charlemont, he assures her, is both a body and a soul. Within this habit, which thy misinformed conceit takes only for a shape, live both the soul and the body of Charlemont. The tension resolved in Charlemont's case is the source of tragedy in the case of Damville, who is the agent of what Calvin would call concupiscence, an exclusive reliance on the physical body and its uncontrollable desires, but also uncertain about the atheistic commitment to the finality of death. Turner ingeniously reworks the elements of revenge tragedy to divide Charlemont's investigation of the causes of these events, his father's death, Castabella's enforced marriage, and the act of revenge. In the next scene, Damville's second son, Sebastian, has an attack of general honesty. And when Damville deliberately mistakes Charlemont for a ghost, and Sebastian's taken in by the deception, a scuffle follows in which the corporeal figure of Charlemont kills Sebastian. This ingeniously comic confrontation that mimics Hamlet's impetuosity gets the better of Charlemont, who momentarily forgets the ghost of Montferrat's first injunction and declares in his pursuit of the wounded Sebastian, "Revenge to thee I'll dedicate this work." Again, in a parody of the closet scene in Hamlet, the ghost of Montferrat reappears to remind his impetuous son of his obligation. "Hold, Charlemont, let him revenge my murder and thy wrongs, to whom the justice of revenge belongs." There follows an interlude in which Sebastian wrestles with the desire to be honest and uses his father's donation of 1,000 crowns, the same sum that Damville had given Charlemont to finance his original absence, to free Charlemont from prison. In prison, Charlemont contemplates heaven's exactment of punishment for his sins as part of a process of sacred justice. And he acknowledges that our own constructions are the authors of our misery. This, of course, is something that Damville can never admit, since he seems unable or unwilling to acknowledge the difference between the accidents for which he is responsible and the divine plan that forces them into a wider scheme of things beyond the physical world to which he dedicates himself. In this, Charlemont is the Calvinistic subject who can face adversity with equanimity because of the strength of his faith that makes him one of the elect, whereas Damville, as his name suggests, is perpetually predestined to damnation. The seriousness of the theology is juxtaposed against the hilarious madness of extreme plotting that makes of Damville an unusually tragic figure whose damnation we can finally support, but whose predicament elicits a degree of sympathy. The play itself, of course, comes to rest in an ingenious conclusion. But from Act 3 onwards, a sharp distinction is made between the emotionally steadfast Charlemont, who has a heart above the reach of thy most violent maliciousness, a fortitude in scorn of thy contempt, since fate is pleased to have me suffer it, that can bear more than thou hast power to inflict. And in this case, the repentant Sebastian, whose help, the donation of 1,000 crowns, Charlemont graciously accepts as a fortunate accident, a reflection, perhaps, of Hamlet's "the readiness is all." Everything that befalls Charlemont, and the extent of what happens is staggering, he withstands with patience. And even at the very end, when he's condemned to death for a crime that he hasn't committed, he advances with enthusiasm to what for him is the life to come. He says, "Damville, to show thee with what like respect I value death and thy insulting pride, thus like a warlike navy on the sea, bound for the conquest of some wealthy land, passed through the stormy troubles of this life, and now arrived upon the armed coast in expectation of the victory whose honour lies beyond this exigent, through mortal danger, with an active spirit, thus I aspire to undergo my death." Now, this is a very muscular Calvinism, but its emphasis is upon a life beyond the grave that will be denied to the atheist. It's this cheerful eye upon the face of death that reveals the true countenance of a noble mind, that so exasperates Damville, who holds Charlemont responsible for having cut off my posterity. At this point, it looks as though Charlemont will be the tragic hero, and there's a danger that he will seem to be smug in the fate that is about to befall him. But Turner moves beyond this, as Damville requests Charlemont's body for an anatomy. Here, Damville proposes an anatomical dissection to discover what there is in nature more exact than in the constitution of myself. Methinks my parts and my dimensions are as many, as large, as well composed as his, and yet in me the resolution wants to die with that assurance as he does. The cause of that, in his anatomy, I would find out. Now, in his book, Issues of Death, Mortality and Identity in English Renaissance Tragedy, in 1997, Michael Neal glosses this speech as an example of the activation of what he says is a pervasive anxiety about the maddening opacity of the human body, which in certain tragedies erupts in shockingly literal displays of anatomical violence. And that's exactly what happens here, when in a brilliantly inventive stroke, Turner engineers it so that the angst-ridden Damville himself will be Charlemont's executioner, who justifies this departure from the normal practice, initially on the grounds of social hierarchy. He says, "The instrument that strikes my nephew's blood shall be as noble as his blood." But as he lifts the axe, the head falls off, and he strikes out his own brains. Utterly bewildered, he asks, "What murderer was he that lifted up my hand against my head?" It's as though driven by some providential force, Damville's hand is lifted up against his head. It would not be possible to stage a more explicit display of violence, though the protagonist is forced mysteriously and uncontrollably to direct it towards himself. The axe opens up Damville's head to reveal his brains, and he's forced to concede to the judge that I outreached thy wit and made thy justice murder's instrument in Castabella's death and Charlemont's, to crown my murder of Montferrers with a safe possession of his wealthy state. This is what it's been all about. This admission of guilt is the nearest that Damville ever gets to a kind of introspection, and he dies acknowledging a power that struck me, that knew the judgment I deserved and gave it. Now, this sensational coup de theatre cannot help, I suggest, but raise a laugh as Damville recognizes nature as a fool, and that there is a power above her that hath overthrown the pride of all my projects and posterity. It's the first judge who emphasizes the power above nature in a gesture that rescues a Lucretian emphasis upon nature for a higher power active in human affairs. He says, the power of that internal providence which overthrew his projects in their pride hath made your Greece the instrument to raise your blessings to a greater height than ever. It's the atheist for whom there is no life after death and no heaven who is condemned to oblivion. In this equation, it's difficult to admire Charlemagne, whom heaven forbids to be mine own revenger, and to trust in a patience that is the honest man's revenge. Indeed, what makes Damville's fate tragic is that he's devoted an extraordinary energy to a project that is doomed to failure. The only energy Charlemagne can summon is to embrace death as the point of entry to eternal life. Indeed, while Turner can see and acknowledge the morality of the situation, he cannot suppress altogether the infernally active and exciting life of his protagonist. Damnation may ultimately be a frightening prospect, but the road to it is paved with enjoyment, as Damville dances along a primrose path until he encounters, surprisingly, the reality of death. In his analysis of the many sins of London, cast in the form of a series of sermons, Thomas Nash identifies the figure of the atheist as a major offender against the acknowledgement of the existence of God. In Christ's Tears over Jerusalem, 1593 and 1594, atheism is the third son of pride. He says, which is when a man is so tympanized with prosperity and entranced from himself with wealth, ambition, and vainglory, that he forgets he had a maker, or that there is a heaven above him which controls him. I have read of many whose extreme joy and extreme grief hath forced to run mad. So with extreme joy runs he mad, he waxeth a fool and an idiot, and then he says in his heart, there is no God. For the atheist, death is ultimately a terrifying experience because it's the moment of truth that is irreversible. Francis Bacon, in his brief essay on atheism, published in 1597, implies as much when he says that atheism depriveth human nature of the means to exalt itself above human frailty. A crucial element of that frailty, of course, is mortality and death. This is what Nash's preacher has to say about the atheist's experience of approaching death. Who heareth the thunder that thinks not of God? I would know who is more fearful to die, or dies with more terror and affrightment than an atheist. Discourse over the ends of an atheist, and their deaths, for the most part, have been drunken, violent, and secluded for repentance. The black, sweaty visage of the night and the shady fancies thereof ascertains every guilty soul. There is a sin-hating God. Now, while Turner's Damville doesn't exactly echo Nash's words, both writers share a sentiment, and Bacon's identification of the atheist's anxiety is also echoed. This is Damville appealing to the court judge at the moment that the axe with which he plans to execute the innocent Charlemagne strikes out his own brains. There was the strength of natural understanding, but nature is a fool. There is a power above her that hath overthrown the pride of all my projects and posterity, for whose surviving blood I had erected a proud monument and struck 'em dead before me, for whose deaths I called to thee for judgment. Thou didst want discretion for the sentence, but yond power that struck me knew the judgment that I deserved and gave it. Oh, the lust of death commits a rape upon me, as I would have done on Castabella. And he dies. The phrase lust of death recalls the anxiety attendant upon the commitment to a material morality driven by what we would recognize as libidinal instinct. Charlemagne's reaffirmation of the power of providence that makes an active revenge unnecessary offers a structurally comic counterbalance to Damville's suffering and death. While the verse may creak a little here, the religious philosophy is strong, and the onstage audience, especially the patient Charlemagne, look on the agony of the atheist who realizes his error too late. Again, Bacon's essay comes to mind when he says that it is true that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds to religion. Danville is not like Marlowe's Faustus, persuaded into evil. He is what he is because of his limited philosophy that dwells upon the senses to discover what Bacon went on to call natural things, but that this focus darkeneth and shutteth up divine. And so Danville's death is not one of despair exactly. Rather, it exposes the limits of a commitment to the fallen world and its transient pleasures, and hence to the terror of the atheistic acknowledgement of the finality of death. Turner's play dallies with the revenge tradition, but recasts its components in order to demonstrate a Calvinist theology that isolates the tragic protagonist while making action as a pathway to correcting the state of the world unnecessary. Danville acts, but his actions are of no use, and Providence intervenes sensationally, whereas Charlemont is patient and he gets his rewards both in this world and presumably the next. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, John, for that really insightful discussion of the play. I wonder whether you consider this play, in the context of what you said, as also as a kind of a backlash of the Reformation, that there was a general uncertainty about truth.
A general uncertainty, yes. And I think as society is becoming more secular, as it's becoming more urbanized, as we're getting conflicts in religion, I mean, the thing is, atheism is very peculiar in this respect, because there's a sense in which atheism, in the way it's represented, seems to take all of the vocabulary of religion and tries to arrogate it to itself. And in a way, you cannot look at atheism without looking at the religion against which it measures itself. So I think that the idea of some kind of universal truth here is problematical, because, I mean, you've got Catholicism on the one hand, you've got Protestantism on the other. And these are two versions of truth. In a way, they don't doubt the existence of a God, but what they question, of course, is the ways in which you come into contact with God. So you have debates about transubstantiation and consubstantiation, the business with the sacraments and things of that kind. So, I mean, there's a sense in which there is an uncertainty. I mean, bear in mind, of course, that, in the England of the late 16th, early 17th century, there is a state religion. You don't get a choice. It's a state religion. And I think it's unthinkable that anybody should step so far outside that. I mean, Machiavelli is accused of being an atheist. No evidence that he is at all. Lucretius was regarded as a source of atheism. And yet, of course, if you read, De Rerum Natura, you find that while he's concerned with, the mechanics of nature, and it's ingenious, some of the explanations he offers, there's no doubt that he thinks of, the prime mover of nature is ultimately some sort of divine being, some sort of, first cause. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why secular history during the period, and I'm thinking particularly here of Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, it starts in the Garden of Eden. It starts with Adam and Eve, and then, moves right through a whole series of time zones. So the thing is, while I think we have a problem, we have a problem with truth, because when you see politicians telling you things that are manifestly untrue, and be represented as truth. And when you see how people believe these things, you do wonder what's going on here. And I think that really is to do with postmodernism as much as anything else. And, the idea of the sort of postmodern questions that you ask about the nature of truth. But I don't think that the Elizabethan, the early Jacobin period were postmodernist in quite that way. We map our own postmodernism onto them, I think. But so that, the question of truth is a complex one here. I mean, there are different kinds of truth, or at least let me put it this way. There are different emphases upon truth, but there are not radically different kinds of truth at this particular time. And I mean, bear in mind that, whatever emphasis you choose to place determines whether you are safe or not in society. In the reign of Mary, Protestants were burned.
Absolutely. There's a question in from Joe Simons. Do you imagine atheism of that time over and against religious sentiments is qualitatively different from the atheism, religious indifference of today, which is what you've been talking about, really?
Yeah. I think it is different. And I think the reason that it's different is because whether you believe in or whether you have faith in a particular religion is a matter of choice. I mean, if you are an atheist, no one is going to hail you off and burn you or hang, draw, and quarter you. It's yours alone. And this is a consequence of a certain kind of individualism, which is political, it seems to me, as much as anything else. Whereas I don't think that in the late 16th, early 17th century, that luxury of free choice was available to everybody. Even the freedom of choice. I mean, go back to Calvin's Institutes, where freedom of choice is always circumscribed. Man he can choose between good and evil, but that choice is circumscribed. It's already been provided for. Whereas I can think anything I like, and nobody is going to castigate me for it. On the other hand, if, for example, I decide to act on what I think, if I'm a right-wing white supremacist and I go and machine gun 51 people in a mosque, as in the news today, obviously we're appalled by that. But at the same time, we would defend a kind of freedom of thought.
But I suppose even in that period, John, that if you were going to write about atheism, there was going to be a problem. You got to get that correct in accordance with the political theology of the time. Otherwise, you would be called an atheist in the way that, posthumously Christopher Marlowe was called an atheist, and probably Kidd as well.
Yes. No, I would agree there. And of course, the thing is, we read these texts differently. I mean, you may think of, a text that challenges atheism while at the same time offering you the philosophy of atheism. In other words, you see what you're being offered. And we see this. I mean, Shakespeare is a master of this, isn't he? What he does is he gives you the orthodox view, but then, of course, there's another view as well that isn't suppressed, so you get them both. And there's a sense in which I think Turner does this too. I think some of these philosophical discussions in the play, we're not expected to take that seriously. They're so outrageous in a way that we're expected to laugh at them. Now, this doesn't mean to say that we laugh at them from the certainty of faith, because I mean, Marlowe's the allegations leveled against Marlowe. I would have said that any university student on a drunken night out could think that up, couldn't they? one way or another. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, we all know the jokes. You know, your wife comes
Yeah.
home and tells you she's just had an affair with an angel. What are you going to do? You know,
Well, you're going back into the mystery place there.
absolutely.
Yeah, the Wakefield Master. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
You see what I mean?
I do.
And I think the assumption that because you have a state religion, that people don't think their way through this. I think it's Zizek in that book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, where he says, there is a kind of practical way of dealing with ideology. You can subscribe to it outwardly, but you can laugh at it as well. And I think that the early modern period was very good at this. And I mean, when you think of the ways in which the various incidents in this particular play take place, I mean, you've got somebody who is supposed to be dead, who comes back, finds a disguise and puts it on, pretends to be a ghost, and then someone else who thinks he's a ghost, and then confronts the ghost, and the ghost whaps him one. I mean, this is pantomime stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it's the sheer fun of this in Turner's play. I mean, I suppose there is a case for saying that perhaps the exuberance of the play is something that it shares with the other play with which he's been from time to time associated, The Revenger's Tragedy, which is equally as exuberant in a way, and where the mood is shared between the two plays.
John, I'm going to have to draw it to a close there.
Right,
But
okay.
but so thank you very much indeed for such an informative and engaging talk today.
Thank you.
The next talk in this series will be on the 26th of January 2021, when my Blackfriars colleague, Dr. Claire Broom-Saunders, will be talking about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. On the 4th of February, Claire Asquith will be talking about Michael Drayton's The Fair Matilda poems. Other talkers next term are Professor Mark Bosco on Flannery O'Connor, that's on the 23rd of February, Professor Noel Sugimura on John Milton on the 9th of March, and Dr. Paul Edmondson on William Shakespeare on the 16th of March. On the 19th of January, we have another Zoom event teaming up once again with the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, when the acclaimed journalist John Kampfner will join an expert panel to discuss the question, where is democracy working today? And please note this event starts at 10 a.m. EST, 3 p.m. GMT, an hour earlier than normal. Can I give my thanks again to John Jakakis today, and also to my co-convener, Joseph Simmons at Campion Hall, Oxford. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. Also, I'd like to thank all those at Georgetown University who made this happen, especially our administrator, Yvonne Kwek, and Shaman Tong, who works to make Zoom presentations possible. A special thanks to Professor Catherine Temple for her support of the project. At Blackfriars, my thanks to Dr. Richard Finn, Director of the Las Casas Institute, to Dr. John O'Connor, the Regent, and Kinga Rona Gabnay, our UK Administrator. At Georgetown, I'd like to thank Dr. Jack DeJoya, President, Dr. Tom Banchef, Vice President, Global Affairs, and Dr. Chris Chilenza, Dean of Georgetown College. And I'd like to send all good wishes to Chris as he moves to a new post at Johns Hopkins University in the new year. Finally, my thanks to you for being in the audience today. Please join us at 10 a.m. EST or 3 p.m. GMT on 19th of January, or the usual time, 11 a.m. EST or 4 p.m. GMT on the 26th of January 2021. In the meantime, everybody, take care, keep safe, and even in these dark times, I hope you still have a happy Christmas. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you and goodbye.